The morning air in Tunisia carried the scent of cordite and sun-baked sand. It was May 19th, 1942, and Corporal James Mitchell of the 1st Infantry Division crouched behind a low stone wall near Gazala, his hands gripping his M1 Garand so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He had been in North Africa for 6 weeks, long enough to know the difference between Italian machine gun fire and German, long enough to understand that the steady chatter of an MG42 meant you kept your head down and waited for your squad's Browning to answer back. But the sound that split the air that morning was something entirely new. It didn't sound like gunfire at all. It sounded like fabric being torn apart, like a giant zipper being pulled at impossible speed, like a carpenter's saw biting through hardwood. 25 rounds per second. His brain couldn't distinguish individual shots anymore. They had blurred into one continuous, mechanical scream that seemed to vibrate in his chest cavity. This was his first encounter with the MG42, and in the space of 10 seconds, everything he thought he knew about German engineering was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The weapon that would come to be known as Hitler's buzzsaw had arrived on the battlefield, and American soldiers were wholly unprepared for what it represented. Within weeks, captured examples would be sent back to ordnance depots for examination. Within months, those same weapons would become objects of both derision and dread. And within 2 years, American engineers would attempt and fail spectacularly to copy what they had initially dismissed as crude German desperation. This is the story of how a machine gun made from stamped metal sheets changed American perceptions of enemy capability, reshaped infantry tactics across all theaters of war, and created a legend that would outlive the conflict itself by 7 decades. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why American soldiers reacted the way they did when they first captured an intact MG42 in the summer of 1942, you must understand what they had been taught to believe about American industrial superiority. The United States Army of 1942 was an institution built on certain fundamental assumptions about manufacturing quality and engineering excellence. American weapons were precision instruments, each component machined from solid steel blocks using techniques that required skilled labor and considerable time. The M1 Garand rifle, for instance, represented the pinnacle of this philosophy, a semi-automatic rifle with a gas-operated mechanism so finely crafted that each weapon required extensive hand-fitting of parts during assembly. The Browning automatic rifle, the squad-level light machine gun that American infantry relied upon, featured beautifully milled components and tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Even the standard-issue M1919 Browning machine gun, the belt-fed weapon that provided covering fire for advancing infantry, was a masterpiece of traditional gunsmithing, heavy, yes, but built to exacting specifications with parts that would last for decades of hard use. This manufacturing philosophy reflected broader American assumptions about the relationship between quality and appearance. A well-made weapon should look well-made. It should have the heft of solid metal, the smooth surfaces of careful machining, the tight tolerances that spoke of precision craftsmanship. These were not merely aesthetic preferences, they were deeply embedded principles of American industrial culture, born from decades of manufacturing experience and reinforced by the very real success of American arms in the Great War. When American doughboys had gone to France in 1917 and 1918, they had brought weapons that worked, that could be maintained in the field, that represented the best traditions of American manufacturing. The Browning M1917 machine gun, water-cooled and heavy as a small anvil, had proven itself in the trenches of the Western Front. It fired the .30-06 Springfield cartridge with methodical reliability, roughly 500 rounds per minute, steady as a metronome. It could fire for hours without failure if properly maintained. It was, by every measure that mattered to American ordnance officers, a superior weapon. This same confidence extended to American assessments of enemy capabilities. German weapons captured during the First World War had been examined and found to be well made, certainly, but not superior to American equivalents. The German Maxim guns were effective but required extensive manufacturing time and resources. Their rifles were bolt-action designs that, while accurate, were slower to operate than the semi-automatic weapons American industry was developing. By 1942, when the United States entered World War II as a full combatant, American ordnance experts believed they understood the trajectory of weapons development. The future belonged to precision manufacturing, to weapons that combined firepower with reliability through careful engineering and quality materials. The German military, they assumed, would continue to produce weapons in this same tradition, perhaps even more elaborately, given German tendencies toward over-engineering. The MG44, the standard German machine gun at the war's outset, seemed to confirm these assumptions perfectly. When American intelligence officers examined captured MG34s in North Africa, they found exactly what they expected: a superbly crafted weapon with machined components, careful tolerances, and a design philosophy that emphasized versatility and precision. The MG34 could function as a light machine gun on a bipod, a medium machine gun on a tripod, or even be mounted in vehicles and aircraft. It featured a clever quick-change barrel system, a dual-feed mechanism that could accept either belt-fed ammunition or a drum magazine, and a rate of fire around 850 rounds per minute, substantially faster than the American Browning, but still within the range that American tactical doctrine could comprehend and counter. The MG34 was, American analysts concluded, an excellent weapon, but it was also expensive and time-consuming to produce, requiring roughly 150 man-hours of skilled labor to manufacture a single gun. This fit perfectly with American assumptions about German military production. The Germans made good weapons, but they required extensive resources and manufacturing time. In a war of industrial attrition, American mass production would inevitably overwhelm German quality. Then came the summer of 1942, and with it, the first encounters with something entirely different. The German Afrika Korps, locked in a desperate struggle with British Commonwealth forces across the deserts of North Africa, had received new weapons. In May of that year, at places like Gazala and Bir Hakeim, Allied soldiers began reporting a new German machine gun with a distinctly different sound. It wasn't the steady chatter of the MG34. It was faster, more continuous, almost insect-like in its mechanical fury. British soldiers, veterans of 2 years of desert warfare, described it as sounding like tearing cloth. Commonwealth troops from various nations developed their own descriptions. The Australians called it Spandau, mistakenly believing the name stamped on captured weapons referred to the manufacturer rather than a Berlin district where some were produced. By late summer, as American forces joined the North African campaign in earnest, they too began encountering this new weapon, and captured examples started making their way back to Allied ordnance depots for examination. What American ordnance officers found when they first examined a captured MG42 in the autumn of 1942 must have seemed almost incomprehensible. The weapon was made from stamped metal, not machined from solid steel blocks, but pressed and formed from sheet metal, like a tin can or a filing cabinet. The receiver, the barrel jacket, the feed mechanism cover all stamped components, spot-welded and riveted together. The surface finish was rough compared to American weapons. You could see the seams where pieces had been joined. The tolerances were looser, the fit less precise. To eyes trained in traditional gunsmithing, trained to associate quality with elaborate machining and tight tolerances, the MG42 looked crude. It looked cheap. It looked like something assembled hastily from whatever materials were available. One ordnance report from this period, written by an American captain, examining a captured specimen, noted with evident disdain that the extensive use of stamping, riveting, and spot welding gives the gun a less finished appearance than that of the MG34. The implication was clear. This was a weapon born of German desperation, a corner-cutting response to material shortages and production bottlenecks. This initial assessment spread rapidly through American military circles. Soldiers in the field, shown captured MG42s by intelligence officers, reportedly laughed at the crude construction. "Look at this garbage," one sergeant was said to have remarked, though the exact quote cannot be verified from primary sources. "Jerry's so desperate he's making guns out of scrap metal now." The sentiment, if not the precise words, was widely shared. American GIs had been raised on stories of German over-engineering, of Tiger tanks with complex transmissions, and Messerschmitt fighters with intricate fuel systems. Here, finally, was evidence that the German war machine was beginning to crack under pressure. They were abandoning quality for quantity, precision for expedience. It confirmed what every American wanted to believe in 1942, that the tide was turning, that German industrial capacity was faltering, that the weight of Allied production would inevitably crush the Wehrmacht's ability to equip its forces with effective weapons. This comforting assessment lasted approximately 6 weeks. By February of 1943, the laughter had stopped entirely. American ordnance authorities had conducted extensive testing on captured MG42s, firing thousands of rounds under controlled conditions, measuring performance characteristics, analyzing failure modes, and comparing capabilities to American equivalents. The report they published in February 1943 was remarkable not for what it said about German weaknesses, but for what it revealed about American misconceptions. The MG42, despite its crude appearance, was functionally superior to every machine gun the Allies possessed in nearly every measurable category. Its rate of fire averaged 1,200 rounds per minute, more than double that of the American Browning, more than twice the British Bren gun's output, even substantially faster than its predecessor, the MG34. But the numbers alone didn't capture what this meant in practical terms. When you fire a machine gun at 1,200 rounds per minute, something psychologically significant happens. The human ear can distinguish individual sounds up to roughly 10 to 15 discrete events per second. Beyond that threshold, separate sounds begin to blur together into a continuous tone. The MG42 fired 20 rounds per second. Your brain simply could not process it as individual shots. Instead, you heard one long, continuous noise, that distinctive tearing sound, that buzzsaw roar that would become the weapon's defining characteristic. For soldiers on the receiving end, this created an effect unlike any other weapon on the battlefield. You couldn't count the rounds. You couldn't estimate the firing pattern. You couldn't use auditory cues to judge when the gunner might need to reload or when a burst would end. It was continuous mechanical violence, and it shaped everything about how infantry approached German positions. Moreover, the testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground and other American ordnance facilities revealed that the crude construction actually provided unexpected advantages. The loose tolerances that looked like poor craftsmanship. They meant the weapon could function reliably in conditions that would jam more precisely made guns. Sand, mud, extreme cold, extreme heat, the MG42 kept firing. The stamped metal construction that seemed cheap, it meant the weapon could be produced in 75 man-hours instead of the MG34's 150 hours, a 50% reduction in manufacturing time. It required only 27.5 kilograms of raw materials instead of 49 kilograms, a 44% reduction. And it cost 250 Reichsmarks to produce instead of 327, a 24% cost reduction. The Germans hadn't abandoned quality for quantity. They had achieved both simultaneously through manufacturing innovations that American industry had never seriously considered for military weapons. The quick-change barrel system was particularly impressive to American ordnance officers. A trained German soldier could swap out an overheated barrel in less than 10 seconds without tools. The barrel simply hinged out to the side, the hot barrel was removed with an asbestos mitt, a fresh barrel was inserted, the mechanism was closed, and the gun was ready to fire again. This meant that the MG42's theoretical rate of fire could be sustained far longer than comparable weapons. American doctrine recommended changing machine gun barrels after firing roughly 250 rounds in sustained fire to prevent dangerous overheating. The Germans had designed their weapon around this reality, making barrel changes so fast and simple that it barely interrupted the weapon's output. German machine gun teams typically carried 6 spare barrels, rotating them continuously during extended engagements. The pile of hot barrels beside an MG42 position became a visual signature of German defensive positions across every theatre of war. But perhaps most disturbing to American tactical thinkers was what the MG42 revealed about German infantry doctrine. American and British military theory in 1943 emphasized the rifleman as the primary infantry weapon. Machine guns provided supporting fire, covering fire to allow rifle squads to maneuver. suppressive fire to keep enemy heads down while riflemen advanced. The machine gun was a support weapon, important certainly, but secondary too. The rifles that actually decided infantry engagements. German doctrine, particularly as it evolved after the introduction of the MG42, was precisely the opposite. In German infantry squads, the machine gun was the primary weapon. Everything else existed to support it. The rifleman's job was to carry extra ammunition for the machine gun, to protect the machine gun crew, to maneuver so that the machine gun had clear fields of fire. This wasn't merely theoretical. Captured German training manuals made it explicit, and battlefield observations confirmed it. German infantry squads maneuvered around their machine gun positions. On defense, they sighted their positions to provide interlocking fields of fire for their MG42s. On offense, they used the overwhelming suppressive fire of the MG42 to pin down defenders, while small assault groups maneuvered to close range. This tactical reality, combined with the weapon's technical capabilities, created severe problems for Allied infantry. Consider the experience of a typical American rifle squad approaching a German defensive position in Italy or France in 1943 or 1944. The squad might consist of 12 men, a squad leader, usually a sergeant, and 11 riflemen, some equipped with M1 Garands, some with Browning automatic rifles for additional firepower. Their job was to close with and destroy the enemy, to seize and hold ground, to accomplish the fundamental task of infantry warfare. To do this, they had to move across open ground, from cover to cover, suppressing enemy positions with their own fire, while maneuvering to advantageous positions. This was difficult enough against any machine gun. Against an MG42, it became exponentially more dangerous. The sound alone created psychological effects that American training had not prepared soldiers to handle. When that distinctive tearing roar erupted from a concealed German position, even veteran soldiers experienced a moment of instinctive terror. Your subconscious mind, even if your conscious thoughts knew better, interpreted that sound as representing more danger than it could rationally quantify. You knew, intellectually, that each individual bullet was no more dangerous than a single round from any other weapon. But your nervous system, your limbic system, your most basic survival instincts, heard that continuous roar and screamed warnings that bypassed rational thought. Green replacements, new soldiers experiencing their first combat, sometimes froze entirely when they heard an MG42 open fire. They would drop flat and refuse to move, paralyzed not by cowardice but by sensory overload, by a sound their brains interpreted as representing impossible levels of threat. Even experienced soldiers found the MG42 psychologically taxing in ways that other weapons were not. A veteran infantry sergeant, interviewed in Sicily in 1943, described the experience this way: "It's the speed that gets you. With our Brownings, you can count the shots, you can feel the rhythm. You know when a burst is ending, when they might be reloading. With the German gun, there's no rhythm. It's just continuous. You can't count it, can't predict it. You just know there's more lead in the air than you can possibly dodge, and you better find good cover fast." This psychological component became so significant that the United States War Department took the extraordinary step of producing a training film specifically designed to reduce soldiers' fear of the MG42. War Department Film Bulletin No. 181, Automatic Weapons American vs. German, was released in 1944, intended for screening to troops preparing for deployment to the European theatre. The film is fascinating less for what it says than for what its very existence reveals about the severity of the problem. The narrator's tone throughout is determinedly reassuring, almost condescendingly so. Their bark is worse than their bite, he intones at one point, as if the distinctive sound of an MG42 were merely an audio curiosity rather than the audible signature of devastating firepower. The film shows a dramatized scene, a young replacement soldier experiencing his first combat action, participating in an attack on a German position defended by an MG42. The replacement is visibly frightened when he hears the weapon's characteristic roar. The narrator comments, "Listen to that, fast. That thing sprays a lot of lead. And you're scared because the German gun fires faster than anything you've run into before, so much faster than the slow, steady bark of American machine guns you heard all through training." But then comes the film's reassurance, delivered with the absolute confidence of official propaganda. Well, so it does have a high rate of fire. Does that mean it is a better fighting weapon than ours? The film then proceeds to a carefully staged comparison. American machine gunners and German gunners using captured MG42's fire at identical targets. The demonstration attempts to show that American guns, firing more slowly but supposedly more accurately, put more rounds on target. The narrator emphasizes that the MG42 wastes ammunition with its high rate of fire, that it's less accurate than American weapons, that its rapid fire makes it harder to control. The German gun is good, the narrator admits, but ours is better. It was obvious propaganda even at the time, and soldiers who had experienced MG42 fire in actual combat were not fooled. But the film's very production reveals how seriously the army took the psychological threat the weapon posed. The reality, as captured in numerous after-action reports and soldier testimonies, was considerably less reassuring than the training film suggested. A junior officer who fought in Sicily provided this assessment in an intelligence document from early 1944. It's true that the Germans have a good machine gun, but, like many other German weapons, it doesn't live up to all the latrine rumours you hear. It doesn't walk on its hind legs or jump through hoops or anything like that. It's just a good, fast gun. I feel that the sooner our men understand how the Germans use it tactically, the more success we'll have in combating it. His words suggest both respect for the weapon and frustration with the mythology that had grown up around it. Other soldiers provided more specific tactical observations. One noted that German machine gun fire is usually so low, often about 1.5 feet above the ground, that we call it grass cutting. The Germans know that US soldiers don't allow their wounded to lie around any longer than is necessary, and that a man who has a leg wound of some kind will probably need a helping hand to get him to safety. It's fairly obvious that the Germans know the value of immobilizing as many men as possible at one time. This was sophisticated tactical thinking, made possible by the MG42's capabilities. By deliberately aiming low, German gunners could wound rather than kill, creating casualties that required multiple soldiers to evacuate, thus removing more men from the immediate battle than killing them outright would accomplish. It was coldly efficient, and it worked because the weapon could maintain such devastating volumes of fire that wounded men couldn't be safely recovered until the gun position was neutralized. Another American officer observed, although the German machine gun is first-rate as to firepower, its dispersion is poor. One of my friends had so much confidence in his ability to get away from it that on one occasion, even though he had already received a number of shoulder wounds, he made a successful dash for safety and then turned and got the machine gunner with rifle fire 3 shots in the stomach. This observation captures an important reality. The MG42, for all its fearsome capabilities, was not invincible. Its high rate of fire meant it burned through ammunition rapidly, creating resupply problems. Its accuracy from a bipod-mounted position was limited. A cool-headed soldier who understood the weapon's characteristics and limitations could exploit those weaknesses. But acquiring that cool-headed understanding required surviving multiple encounters with the weapon, and many soldiers did not. The casualty statistics tell their own story. While exact figures attributing deaths to specific weapons are impossible to determine, analysis of wound patterns and battlefield reports suggest that German machine guns, particularly the MG42, accounted for a disproportionate number of Allied casualties in the European theatre. One study of American casualties in Normandy found that roughly 70% of wounds were caused by artillery and mortar fragments, with the remaining 30% roughly evenly divided between small arms fire and other causes. But within that small arms category, wounds inflicted during assaults on defended positions, precisely the situations where German machine guns were most effectively employed, predominated. The MG42 shaped how infantry combat was conducted in ways both obvious and subtle. The weapon's influence extended beyond immediate tactical considerations to fundamental questions of industrial production and engineering philosophy. By late 1943, American ordnance authorities were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. The Germans had achieved something American industry had not seriously attempted. They had created a weapon that was simultaneously cheaper, faster to produce, more reliable under adverse conditions, and more effective in its primary role than anything the United States military possessed. This realization prompted serious discussions about whether American industry should attempt to replicate German manufacturing techniques. The result of those discussions was the T-24 machine gun project, an attempt to reverse engineer the MG42 for American use that would become one of the most embarrassing failures in U.S. ordnance history. The project began in earnest in early 1943, following the publication of the first comprehensive American assessment of the MG42. The report, based on extensive testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground and other facilities, noted that the quick barrel changing and belt feed systems were considered some of its best design features. The U.S. Army wanted to manufacture this general-purpose machine gun because it was lighter and simpler to make than other American light and medium machine guns. The decision was made to convert several captured MG42s to fire .30-06 Springfield ammunition, the standard American cartridge, and use those conversions as the basis for American production. The contract went to Saginaw Steering Gear, a division of General Motors with extensive experience in precision manufacturing and wartime production conversion. If anyone could successfully reverse engineer a German weapon, it should have been Saginaw. They had the manufacturing expertise, the engineering talent, the resources, and captured examples of the weapon to study. The engineers at Saginaw began their work with confidence. They stripped down captured MG42s, measured every component, analyzed the metallurgy, studied the operating mechanism, and set about creating American versions chambered for .30-06 ammunition. The design was modified as minimally as possible to maintain the weapon's essential characteristics while adapting it to American ammunition. 2 prototype weapons were produced, designated T-24. They looked nearly identical to the German original, featuring the same stamped steel construction, the same roller locking mechanism, and the same quick-change barrel system. On paper, the T-24 should have worked. In practice, it failed spectacularly. Testing began in January of 1944 at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The first prototype was loaded with a belt of .30-06 ammunition, and an ordnance specialist pulled the trigger. The gun fired exactly 1 shot. Then it jammed, failing to eject the spent cartridge case. The testers cleared the malfunction and tried again. 1 shot, jam. The weapon simply refused to function. The second prototype performed slightly better. It at least managed to fire multiple rounds before experiencing failures, but it was plagued by constant ejection problems and feeding difficulties. During the testing period from January to February 1944, the weapon suffered 51 malfunctions after firing only 1,583 rounds. The average cyclic rate of fire, when the gun actually worked, was 614 rounds per minute, barely faster than existing American machine guns, and nowhere close to the MG42's 1,200 rounds per minute. By March 1944, the U.S. military reached its conclusion. The official report stated that functioning of the T-24 machine gun prototype was unsatisfactory and recommended that further development was required before this weapon be subjected to the lengthy and severe standard but light machine gun test. This was military bureaucratic language for, "It doesn't work, and we're abandoning the project." The reason for the failure was eventually determined. The .30-06 Springfield cartridge was too long for the weapon's roller locking mechanism to reliably handle. The MG42 had been designed around the 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser cartridge, which had different dimensional characteristics and operating pressures. Simply chambering the weapon for a different cartridge wasn't enough. The entire .bit operating system would need to be redesigned from the ground up. And if you were going to redesign the operating system, you might as well design an entirely new weapon rather than trying to copy the German one. The T-24's failure revealed something profound about the MG42's design sophistication. What had looked crude and simple was actually a carefully balanced system where every component worked in precise relationship to every other component. The stamped metal construction, the roller locking mechanism, the recoil operation, the feed system, the barrel design, all of these elements had been optimized to work together with the specific 7.92 mm Mauser cartridge under specific conditions. Change one variable, and the entire system stopped functioning reliably. The Germans hadn't simply stamped out metal parts and bolted them together. They had conducted sophisticated engineering analysis, materials science research, and extensive testing to create a weapon that only appeared simple. The apparent crudeness was actually elegant simplification, the removal of everything unnecessary to achieve maximum effect with minimum resources. This realization forced American ordnance authorities to reconsider their fundamental assumptions about weapons design. A report from this period recommended that a new type machine gun be designed, based on the German machine gun if necessary, in which stampings will take the place of expensive machine parts, and in which headspace adjustment will not be necessary. A gun patterned after the German machine gun is adaptable to mass production methods of manufacture and can be turned out at a fraction of the cost and in greater quantity. The recommendation also suggested consideration should be given to the design of a gun with an adjustable rate of fire, which can be varied between that of the Browning and of the German machine gun. These recommendations would eventually influence post-war American machine gun development, but they came too late to affect World War II production. Meanwhile, on battlefields across Europe, American soldiers continued to face the MG42 under increasingly desperate circumstances. The weapon reached its peak deployment in 1944, when Germany was defending on all fronts and needed maximum defensive firepower from minimum personnel. That year, German industry produced 211,806 MG42s, the highest annual production of the war. These weapons flooded into German units across the Eastern Front, in Italy, in France, defending every position that the Wehrmacht sought to hold. The MG42 became ubiquitous, the signature sound of German defensive tactics from the ruins of Cassino to the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen forests of the Ardennes. The weapon's effectiveness in defensive roles was particularly notable at Monte Cassino in Italy, where German paratroopers held Allied forces for nearly 4 months from January to May of 1944. The Fallschirmjäger, German airborne troops, were elite units trained in the aggressive use of automatic weapons. They transformed the ruins of the monastery and surrounding hills into a fortress, sighting their MG42s to create interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach. Allied forces attacking up the steep slopes toward German positions had to cross open ground under sustained machine gun fire from multiple positions simultaneously. The casualty rates were appalling. Polish troops of the Second Corps, who finally captured the monastery in May, left 1,293 dead in the rubble, with another 4,000 wounded. While artillery and mortar fire inflicted many of these casualties, the testimony of survivors consistently emphasized the devastating effect of German machine guns in preventing movement across exposed terrain. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The most famous or infamous employment of the MG42 came on June 6, 1944, during the Allied invasion of Normandy. On Omaha Beach, German defensive positions overlooked the landing zones from elevated positions on the bluffs. These positions, designated Widerstandsnests or resistance nests, were concrete bunkers and fortified positions equipped with multiple weapons, including artillery, mortars, and machine guns. One of these positions, Widerstandsnest 62, was manned by Obergefreiter Heinrich Sevelow, a German soldier who would later become known, somewhat sensationally, as the Beast of Omaha. Sevelow's post-war memoir claims he personally fired 13,500 rounds through his MG42 during the invasion, inflicting over 2,000 casualties on American forces storming the beach below his position. These numbers are almost certainly exaggerated. Total casualties on Omaha Beach from all sources were roughly 3,700, but the claim is revealing for what it says about the MG42's reputation. Even if Sevelow's personal tally is inflated by a factor of 10, the fact that anyone would believe a single machine gunner could fire that many rounds and inflict that many casualties speaks to the weapon's established reputation for devastating effectiveness. What is verifiable is that German machine gun positions on the bluffs above Omaha Beach inflicted severe casualties on American forces during the critical early hours of the invasion. First-wave assault troops suffered casualty rates approaching 90% in some sectors. While many of these casualties came from artillery and mortar fire, the interlocking machine gun fire from positions like Widerstands Nest 62 made it nearly impossible for troops to advance across the beach or find cover. Contemporary accounts from American soldiers who survived Omaha Beach consistently emphasize the terror of being pinned down on open sand while German machine guns raked the beach. One survivor recalled, "The sound was everywhere. You couldn't tell where it was coming from, the bluffs, the bunkers. It seemed to come from every direction at once. That tearing sound, like the whole world was being ripped apart. Men were getting cut down before they even got off the landing craft ramps." Another described lying flat in the sand, trying to use bodies of dead soldiers for cover, while tracers from German machine guns formed an almost solid wall of fire above the beach. You could see the tracers every fifth round was a tracer, and there were so many of them it looked like a solid sheet of light. If you raised your head even 6 inches, you knew you were dead. The casualty toll on Omaha Beach, while caused by multiple weapon systems working in coordination, represented the MG42's effectiveness in its ideal tactical employment. German doctrine called for machine guns to be sighted in mutually supporting positions with overlapping fields of fire, positioned to cover obstacles and channeling enemy movement into kill zones, protected by other defensive positions to prevent flanking attacks. Omaha Beach exemplified this doctrine perfectly. The German defenders had months to prepare their positions, to calculate precise firing angles, to stockpile ammunition, to rehearse their defensive plans. When American troops landed, they walked into a killing ground that had been carefully prepared with German engineering precision. The MG42s were only one component of this defensive system, but they were the component that created the continuous suppressive fire that prevented American forces from moving, from finding cover, from organizing effective assaults on the German positions. The beach was eventually taken, of course. American forces, despite devastating casualties, maintained pressure on German positions throughout the day. Naval gunfire and aerial bombardment gradually degraded German defensive positions. Small groups of infantry found ways to infiltrate the bluffs, attacking German positions from the flanks and rear. By nightfall of June 6th, American forces had established a precarious toehold on Omaha Beach, though at terrible cost. The lesson, if there was one, was not that the MG42 could be easily countered. It was that American forces could absorb casualties that would have broken other armies and continue attacking until German positions were overrun through sheer determination and material superiority. This pattern repeated itself across the European theatre throughout 1944 and into 1945. German forces, increasingly outnumbered and outgunned, relied on the MG42's firepower to compensate for their numerical inferiority. A well-sighted machine gun position, properly supplied with ammunition and supported by other weapons, could hold up advancing Allied forces many times its size, at least temporarily. The Allied response was typically to call in artillery fire or airstrikes to suppress or destroy the German position, then advance under the cover of overwhelming firepower. This was effective but costly in time, in ammunition expenditure, and frequently in casualties. The alternative infantry assaults without preparatory fires was possible, but resulted in prohibitive losses. American soldiers developed various tactical responses to the MG42 threat. Small unit leaders learned to use terrain more effectively, to move from cover to cover rather than attempting to cross open ground, to coordinate suppressive fire from their own weapons while maneuvering elements flanked German positions. The Browning automatic rifle, while slower firing than the MG42, was effective for suppressing individual machine gun positions long enough for riflemen to advance. Mortar. Teams learned to respond quickly when German machine guns opened fire, dropping high-explosive rounds on suspected positions. Tank support, when available, provided both mobile cover for infantry and direct fire capability against fortified positions. None of these solutions eliminated the threat, they merely made it manageable, gave infantry squads a chance to close with and destroy German positions without being annihilated in the attempt. But the psychological toll remained significant throughout the war. Veterans of the European theatre carried memories of that distinctive sound for the rest of their lives. In the decades after the war, some would experience involuntary stress responses when they heard certain noises, a drill press, a sewing machine, fabric being torn, any sound that approximated that tearing roar. This was not weakness or cowardice. It was the entirely rational response of a nervous system that had been conditioned, through repeated exposure under life-threatening circumstances, to associate that specific sound with imminent death. Modern understanding of post-traumatic stress would recognize these responses as normal reactions to sustained combat exposure. In the 1940s and 50s, veterans simply lived with them, often in silence, understanding that no one who hadn't experienced that sound in combat could truly comprehend its psychological impact. The German military's own assessment of the MG42 was consistently positive throughout the war. Captured training manuals and after-action reports describe it as reliable, effective, and well-suited to German tactical doctrine. German soldiers appreciated its firepower, its reliability under adverse conditions, and its relatively light weight compared to other medium machine guns. At roughly 25 pounds, it was substantially lighter than water-cooled heavy machine guns while providing comparable firepower. The quick-change barrel system was particularly valued. German machine gunners could maintain sustained fire far longer than their Allied counterparts, without being forced to cease fire for barrel changes. The weapon's main drawback, acknowledged in German tactical doctrine, was its prodigious ammunition consumption. At 1,200 rounds per minute, even a short burst consumed more ammunition than Allied machine guns would fire in sustained bursts. This required German infantry squads to dedicate significant personnel to ammunition. Carrying typically 3 riflemen in a 6-man machine gun crew carried nothing but ammunition, spare barrels, and tools. This ammunition consumption became increasingly problematic as German logistics deteriorated in the final year of the war. By late 1944, many German units were experiencing severe ammunition shortages. Machine gunners were instructed to fire shorter bursts, to carefully select targets, to conserve ammunition for critical moments. This reduced the MG42's effectiveness somewhat, but even with restricted ammunition, it remained a formidable weapon. A short burst of 20 or 30 rounds from an MG42, representing only 1 or 2 seconds of fire, still put more lead downrange than comparable bursts from Allied machine guns. German defenders in the Ardennes offensive of December 1944, despite severe ammunition constraints, still used their MG42s effectively enough to inflict heavy casualties on American forces during the initial German breakthrough. The weapon's influence on post-war military thinking was profound and lasting. When World War II ended in May 1945, Allied forces captured hundreds of thousands of MG42s. Many were simply destroyed as part of general disarmament, but many others were retained, studied, and eventually put into service by the armies of various nations. France adopted captured MG42s for use by French forces, rechambering some for French 8mm Lebel ammunition. Yugoslavia not only used captured weapons, but reverse-engineered the design and began domestic production of a near-identical copy designated the M53. Various African and Asian nations that received military aid from either Western or Eastern Bloc countries during the Cold War ended up with MG42s or derivatives, and some of these weapons remained in service well into the 21st century. But the most remarkable legacy of the MG42 came from Germany itself. When West Germany rearmed in the 1950s and joined NATO, the new Bundeswehr needed modern military equipment, including machine guns. There was extensive debate about whether to adopt an American or British design, to develop something entirely new, or to resurrect German weapons from before the Nazi era. In the end, the Bundeswehr chose to put the MG42 back into production. There was one significant problem. The original engineering drawings had been destroyed at the war's end as part of Allied disarmament policies. The Germans solved this by obtaining an MG42 from a museum collection in the United States, transporting it to Germany, completely disassembling it, measuring every component with precision instruments, and creating entirely new engineering drawings from the physical weapon. The new version, modified to fire the 7.62mm NATO cartridge rather than the original 7.92mm Mauser round, was designated the MG1. It was virtually identical to the wartime MG42 in all essential characteristics: same operating mechanism, same rate of fire, same quick-change barrel system, same basic design philosophy. Later versions incorporated minor improvements and were redesignated the MG1A3 and eventually the MG3. The German military used versions of the MG42 design continuously from the 1950s through the present day, over 70 years of T-SAT service, making it one of the longest-serving military firearms designs in history. Other nations adopted the design as well. Austria produced the MG74, Italy manufactured the MG42/59, and various other countries either purchased German-made weapons or produced local variants under license. The influence extended beyond direct copies to the broader category of general-purpose machine guns. The MG42 had demonstrated that a single weapon could effectively fulfill multiple roles: light machine gun, medium machine gun, vehicle-mounted weapon, even limited anti-aircraft capability if properly designed. This general-purpose concept revolutionized post-war machine gun development. The American M60 machine gun, introduced in the late 1950s as a replacement for the various Browning designs, incorporated design elements influenced by study of the MG42, particularly the quick-change barrel system and the general-purpose concept. The Belgian FN Mag, perhaps the most successful general-purpose machine gun ever designed, was directly influenced by the MG42's design philosophy and went on to be adopted by over 80 countries, including the United States, which designated it the M240. Today, American forces in combat around the world carry M240s that trace their conceptual lineage directly back to that weapon American soldiers once mocked for its stamped steel construction. The story of the MG42 and American soldiers' reactions to it is ultimately a story about the danger of assumptions, about the gap between appearance and performance, about how preconceptions can blind us to reality until that reality becomes undeniable through bitter experience. When American ordnance officers first examined captured MG42s in the autumn of 1942, they saw stamped metal and loose tolerances and concluded they were looking at evidence of German desperation and a declining quality. They were wrong. They were looking at sophisticated engineering that had achieved goals. American industry hadn't attempted creating a weapon that was simultaneously cheaper, faster to manufacture, more reliable, and more effective than supposedly superior traditionally manufactured designs. The Americans couldn't copy it successfully because it was far more sophisticated than it appeared, because the apparent simplicity was actually elegant complexity, because you can't reverse engineer intuitive manufacturing know-how by simply measuring dimensions. American soldiers in the field learned these lessons more directly and at higher cost. The man who laughed at stamped steel construction was, within weeks, diving for cover when that same stamped steel weapon opened fire on his position. The replacement soldier, who froze in terror at the MG42's distinctive roar if he survived, eventually learned to function despite that fear, learned to use terrain and tactics to minimize exposure, learned that the weapon, for all its fearsome capabilities, could be defeated by infantry willing to accept casualties and maintain pressure on German positions. This knowledge was purchased with blood and measured in casualty statistics, and carried in the memories of veterans for the rest of their lives. The transformation of American attitudes toward the MG42, from mockery to terror to grudging respect to attempted replication to lasting influence, represents a microcosm of broader American experiences in World War II. The United States entered the war confident in its industrial superiority, convinced that American manufacturing know-how and engineering excellence would overwhelm Axis forces through sheer material superiority. This confidence was not entirely misplaced. American industrial production did prove decisive in the war's outcome, but the path to victory required learning uncomfortable lessons about enemy capabilities, about the relationship between resources and innovation, about how desperation and material constraints could sometimes drive more creative solutions than abundance and established manufacturing traditions. The German military lost World War II despite possessing weapons like the MG42, not because these weapons were ineffective, but because individual weapon superiority cannot overcome comprehensive strategic disadvantages. Germany was outnumbered, outproduced, fighting on multiple fronts against enemies with vastly greater resources. No amount of tactical innovation or weapons engineering excellence could compensate for fundamental strategic impossibilities. But within that broader context of inevitable defeat, the MG42 represented German military engineering at perhaps its most effective, a weapon that achieved maximum effect with constrained resources, multiplied the combat power of infantry units, and influenced how battles were fought across every theatre of the European war. For American soldiers who faced the MG42 in combat, these strategic considerations were abstractions. What mattered was the immediate tactical reality. Somewhere ahead, concealed in a fortified position or a hastily dug foxhole or the rubble of a destroyed building, a German soldier sat behind an MG42 with belts of ammunition and spare barrels and orders to hold his position. Your job was to cross the open ground between your position and his, to close with and destroy that position, to accomplish the mission despite knowing that the weapon pointed in your direction could fire 20 rounds per second, could cut you literally in half if the gunner drew a bead on you, could maintain that devastating rate of fire for as long as ammunition held out. Some soldiers found the courage to move despite that knowledge. Some froze, some were killed, some survived, but none of them forgot the sound, that distinctive tearing roar, that buzzsaw scream that announced you were in the presence of one of the most effective infantry weapons ever designed. Private First Class Leonard Liniewski, an army truck driver, was driving through a recently secured area in Belgium in late 1944 when he spotted an abandoned MG42 in a field beside the road. Liniewski, being an enterprising soldier far from the direct oversight of officers, stopped his truck and retrieved the weapon. He intended to keep it as a war trophy, a souvenir to take home when the war ended. There was one problem. As a support soldier, Liniewski had no idea how to disassemble the gun for transport or storage. So he held onto the weapon, carrying it with him as his unit moved through Belgium and into Germany, until he eventually found a camp holding German prisoners of war. He convinced captured German soldiers, men who had used the weapon in combat, to show him how to properly break it down. That captured MG42, which Liniewski did eventually take home, is now part of the collection at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, where visitors can examine it and reflect on its history. Think about what Liniewski's story represents. An American soldier wanted this weapon, not a Luger pistol, not a Nazi flag, not a helmet or bayonet or any of the other common war trophies, but specifically an MG42. He wanted it badly enough to keep it with him for weeks or months, despite the logistical inconvenience of carrying a 25-pound machine gun that wasn't part of his regular equipment. He wanted it badly enough to approach enemy prisoners of war and ask for their assistance. This wasn't the behavior of a man who viewed the weapon as crude German scrap metal. This was the behavior of a man who recognized, as thousands of other American soldiers had come to recognize through direct experience, that he was in possession of something remarkable, something that represented the pinnacle of a particular type of military engineering, something worth keeping despite all rational arguments against doing so. Liniewski's impulse to acquire the weapon as a trophy was shared by thousands of other American soldiers. After-action reports from across the European theatre mention soldiers attempting to retain captured MG42s, trying to get them back to rear areas, asking superiors if they could keep them. This stood in stark contrast to soldiers' attitudes toward other captured German weapons. Carabiner 98 rifles were curiosities, examined and then discarded or turned into intelligence officers. Luger pistols were prized for their cachet as trophies, but not particularly valued as functional weapons. But MG42s? Soldiers wanted those. They wanted to test them, to fire them, to understand how they worked, to possess them as tangible evidence that they had faced and survived the most fearsome infantry weapon on the battlefield. This transformation from mockery to acquisition occurred over the span of roughly 30 months, from summer 1942, when American forces first encountered the weapon in Tunisia, to spring 1945, when the war in Europe ended. 30 months during which hundreds of thousands of American soldiers rotated through combat zones, during which the MG42 fired billions of rounds at Allied forces, during which its distinctive sound became as much a part of the European battlefield's audio landscape as artillery fire or aircraft engines. 30 months during which American assumptions about German engineering capabilities underwent fundamental revision, forced by reality, paid for in casualties, proven in the failure of the T-24 project and the success of German defensive tactics built around the weapon. The final irony is that American forces defeated Germany despite the MG42, not by matching its capabilities or copying its design, but by accepting that some enemy weapons were superior in specific categories and compensating through superiority in other areas. American forces had better logistics, better artillery support, better air power, better strategic mobility, and ultimately greater numbers. They could call in fire support that German forces couldn't match. They could replace casualties at rates German units couldn't sustain. They could maintain offensive pressure continuously, while German forces, even with superior weapons, had to husband their limited resources and eventually retreat or be destroyed. The MG42 was a magnificent weapon, perhaps the best machine gun of World War II, but magnificence alone does not win wars when your nation is outmatched strategically, industrially, and numerically. For the individual soldier facing that weapon in combat, strategic considerations provided no comfort. You still had to cross the open ground. You still had to assault the position. You still had to hear that sound and move toward it, despite every survival instinct screaming at you to stay down, stay hidden, stay safe. The soldiers who did this, who functioned effectively despite fear, who completed missions despite casualties, who maintained cohesion and discipline under the stress of sustained combat, deserve recognition not just for their courage, but for their adaptability. They learned, faster than their doctrine and training had prepared them to learn, how to fight against an enemy who held tactical advantages in specific areas. They learned to respect enemy capabilities without being paralyzed by that respect. They learned that superior weapons could be overcome through superior tactics, through accepting necessary risks, through maintaining pressure, even when casualties mounted. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.